Secretary again? What's the secretary?
I made it. Right.
All of the administrivia, playing with the data tracker, playing with the data tracker.
So last piece road I got started on the express train.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, great. You've got structured headers, structured fields.
Whether you want them or not.
Yeah. But a few groups have them, some of the bigger ones mainly. And this is also because, you know, this is Daryl's first time at the IETF, being the chair also. So, what? Yeah. He doesn't know about
I
the
was a child
ceremony.
of the pandemic.
He doesn't know about the ceremonial dunking in the Thames yet.
So, we're at time?
We are. Let us begin. Okay, everyone, good morning. Welcome to the HTTP API working group.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. All right. Is this better? Okay, good. Welcome to the HTTP API working group. Contrary to other IETF acronyms, that is not easily pronounceable. It's, if you say it, it'll, you know, it's like Bronx Cheers, as they say. Okay.
Can we confirm people online can hear?
Yeah. Can somebody online please like get on the queue and then leave? We have 23 people, well, including locals. All right. So Francesca, our AD. Okay. So people came and left. So good. I have a cold, only a cold. So, oh, and people are streaming it. So, all right. This is Tuesday morning. You should have seen the QR codes. They are outside, also up there. Have your phone, please point your phone to it. That will get you the lightweight client. If you want to talk, you will have to press a button on that client or tap a button on that client to get entered into the queue. We will manage the queue through MeetEcho. All right. Everyone's feels like a rock concert. Everyone's, you know, holding their phones up. Yep. Okay. Shall we get?
We should.
Go for it.
I'm sure all of you have. I can do this one. I'm sure all of you have seen by now the Notewell. Here it is once again. Please follow these rules. Yeah, I think Rich has said most of these things. The only extra thing, did you mention the mask wearing in the room? Unless you're at the mic, please keep wearing a mask. And we need a volunteer to take the minutes of the meeting. Do we have a volunteer, please?
I mean, I can do it.
You want to do it?
Sure.
Okay. So I shall let Rich get to his place in his notes. And then, Ben, are you ready to do your presentation? He says, not being able to see the chat. There's Ben on that video.
Good morning. Good morning.
Let's just give Rich just a moment to get started.
So thank you to the chairs for letting me put this presentation at the top of the session. Of course, it's 4:30 in the morning here, so I don't know how great that really is, but I had a conflict with another working group. So this is not a top priority item for HTTP API. It's just scheduled here due to a timing conflict.
Okay. Floor is yours.
I've requested slide access.
working. You want to try that again? Where is it? Do you see it? I don't see it.
Yeah.
It's all right. There we go. Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you. So this is the same slide deck for consistency's sake. This is the same presentation that I gave to OAuth yesterday. I will be saying some slightly different things, but these are the same slides that you saw in OAuth. So feel free to to eat your croissant if you were already in OAuth yesterday. So interactive authentication of non-interactive HTTP requests, that's a mouthful. I call this pop-up authentication. And the key idea is this: the web today has a rich login experience. There's a whole panoply of different ways that you can log into a website. You can use complicated single sign-on things to use one account from one web service with a different web service. And then when you're actually logging in, maybe you can use a YubiKey or a passkey or any number of other tricky second factor things that give you a lot of extra security. There are password recovery flows if you've forgotten your password and all sorts of great stuff. And this is what login looks like if you're trying to use HTTP and you're not actually on the web. There's a server address field maybe, and there's a username and a password. So basically, if you're outside of the web, login is stuck in 1996. We don't even have a password recovery option. We don't even have any reasonable way to rotate these passwords, which are usually hard-coded into the settings and forgotten. And OAuth doesn't really today get us what we want, because OAuth is designed for a client that's registered with a specific service that already knows some proprietary details about how to communicate with a specific service in advance. And what we are really trying to get to here is a way for clients like that CalDAV client that I mentioned, that I showed on the previous slide, to be able to speak a standardized protocol to any compatible origin. So this is the kind of user experience that I'm imagining we could achieve. Imagine that you have some service configured on your system. You've configured it basically by dropping a URL into some settings field, probably. And then this service says, actually, I need authentication. So your system pops up a little notice that you're going to need to authenticate, and then takes you to a browser-like authentication experience that shows you whatever that service wants to do. Maybe it's a CAPTCHA, maybe it's single sign-on, maybe it bounces you through a couple different origins before determining that you're authenticated. And then, eventually that browser closes itself when it's done, and you see a notification that authentication is complete. So this is the draft protocol that's listed in the document, but I should say that Aaron Parecki of OAuth helped me out yesterday to understand a bunch of OAuth things, and actually added a bunch of slides here to describe how this would work in OAuth. So I'll try to keep this very brief. But the idea here is the client tries to do something protocol specific, like this is an initial CalDAV request. It gets back an HTTP 401, and it gets back some kind of new www authenticate response that indicates no, no, you're not allowed to do this, and you can authenticate by opening this web page. And then, so this web page is open now in a different, essentially by a different user agent in a browser. And then the user again gets a 401 unauthorized. In this version, they get a 401 unauthorized, and then they do some other stuff. Maybe get a cookie for that. Get a 200 response. That is interpreted as meaning you can close the browser. You've successfully retrieved that authentication resource, and then in this version of the protocol, the sort of non-interactive client, you could think of it as like a command line utility maybe, steals the cookie, reaches into the browser state, steals that cookie out, and then uses it to successfully reach the CalDev server. So I don't want to focus too much on this specified procedure, except to say that it has this, it's based on this idea that the client in question can sort of spin up a browser context into which it has privileged access of the requests and responses. Oh.
Yep, I'm sure it'll come back in a sec. There
Hey, my network connection to Meet Echo has been somewhat unstable. Can you reapprove? Thank you.
Yes, done.
So that's this version, and I'm going to skip the details of that spec. So the bottom line is that I want to solve this use case. And let me skip one more slide ahead, and I'll come back. So this slide is from Aaron, who proposes an alternative approach here, which essentially takes OAuth 2.0 and a couple more extensions beyond what exists today in OAuth 2.0. So we would have to write at least one or two OAuth extensions to define specifically the new thing here is this location parameter, which just like before tells the recipient, I need you to authenticate, and here's the web page that you can open to be able to authenticate. So, so I think really, and I can just briefly show you that this is now looks more or less like an ordinary OAuth flow, and again, this opens an OAuth context that eventually that will result in in the original request, in this case the CalDAV request, carrying a bearer authorization token. So the main thing I want to present to the working group is this function, do you essentially view this as being something that's best thought of as essentially a very strange OAuth variant where we solve this using OAuth and a bunch of OAuth extensions to get to a very special OAuth behavior? Or is this actually kind of a core HTTP function and we should basically define a very simple HTTP extension that gets us to this ability? And so I'm seeking adoption, but I think which working group this goes in definitely depends on the technical aspects of the solution. Martin?
So Martin Thompson, I think you probably skipped a step there. I'd like to talk a little bit about the use case before we start talking about how we might sort of address that sort of thing. When I first read this draft, it was pretty horrifying, I have to say, to have the notion that you might have arbitrary pieces of code that might pop up browsers in various contexts is a little bit scary. We spent a lot of time trying very, very carefully not to have pop-ups appear in various contexts, and this seems like a pretty smooth path to that for someone who wants that capability. That said, there may be some ways in which you can frame this that might make that a little bit more acceptable for people. I don't know. I didn't see any sort of discussion of sort of abuse or any of those sorts of other things in here.
Yeah, well, so here's my sort of nod to the abuse problem, that anytime this happens, in my proposed UX here, you are directed to, you're presented with a pop-up that gives you the option to actually accept this pop-up, or to basically go to the settings that is triggering this and get rid of this thing that is sending you pop-ups.
Yeah. So you got a pop-up to manage the pop-ups status. Yeah, this is exactly the sort of thing that I think is really important to discuss, because these sorts of interaction models are difficult to understand. I think there's a number of use cases in which this sort of behavior would be very, very useful. I just published a Rust crate this morning, and I hadn't used this machine to publish them before, and there's a command line process that ultimately asks me to go off to a web page and copy and paste a token from the web page, and that's sort of error prone and fraught, and concentrating on that use case would be, I think, reasonable. In that context, you would probably just fire up the browser and everything would be fine. But I'm not sure that that's the end of the story here. I think we need to talk about what it means to fire up a browser context in this, whether or not you really do want to have the application in control of the browser context to the extent necessary to do the sorts of things that you're talking about here, or whether there is something else that is more appropriate for signaling back to the application. I think there's probably more to be said also about the nature of the signal that you use to determine that the authentication process is complete as well. So those are the sorts of things that I think we should probably concentrate on before we sort of talk about whether this is OAuth or not. I think perhaps I'm leaning toward an HTTP thing, but that's because I'm an HTTP familiar person and not an OAuth person. It seems more general.
So, interesting. So thank you, Martin. I'll just say that I was just slightly surprised by your last note, because your other comments sound actually a lot like what I think of as sort of the OAuth perspective, where OAuth has spent a lot of time thinking about the UX of transitioning between these different contexts, about the different signals that indicate termination. That's all been sort of discussed extensively in the OAuth context.
Mike?
Mike?
Mike Bishop. I'm sympathetic to the abuse concern, although presumably this is a context in which you would have gotten a pop-up anyway, asking for username and password. So we're swapping one pop-up for another. So as long as an app is already able to do that pop-up, I'm not particularly concerned about them being able to do this pop-up instead. I'm a little less happy about the whole reach into the browser and extract the cookie part. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the current way to do this, if you need a rich sign-in, is to launch the browser to OAuth and give it the completion URL as something on the local machine. Is that correct?
Yeah, so one of the standard patterns for this is to say there's something called a redirect URI, which you declare to be a server running on localhost. And that's how you get a signal back from the login flow.
So I'm trying to understand what this solves that doesn't. Is it simply that the thing that's launching the pop-up doesn't want to have to host its own server on localhost?
So in OAuth today, your client has to know out of band what the authentication flow is for the service that it's using. OAuth does not standardize that.
Okay.
So, like for example, imagine in like I don't know if you've run across JMap. It's like, kind of HTTP API for IMAP. So imagine you have a general purpose JMap client. How do you configure it? Ideally, you would just put in a URL for a JMap endpoint, but now you need a way to log into that service. Currently, I think you would have to, your client would have to have out-of-band awareness of the specific authorization page that's used for any given JMAP service in addition to the JMAP URL.
So that really feels like you just need a way to pass the URL then. So a way to pass the URL and a way to deal with the redirect URI when it's done. Is that
yeah,
clear?
and we can, if we sort of go all in on an OAuth model, then we can just use the OAuth redirect URI stuff, and maybe that's all we need.
Yeah. So to me, that feels like the simplest way to get to this URI, which I agree. This is a UI I would want to enable for more things. That feels like the simplest path. So I'd kind of like to see this land in OAuth.
Hi, Aaron Pruggy from the OAuth group. Yeah, I just wanted to say, can you actually go to that slide, the first slide that I sent you? So after Ben presented this to the OAuth group yesterday, I was looking at it and I said, I feel like we have almost all the pieces already put together in OAuth itself, except for this one piece, which is driving the location of where to go log in, given the location of the server you're trying to access. So in this example, it's drop in a calendar URL to the client, and that's the only thing that you plug into the client, and then you need to sort of drive the login from that. So this is essentially the only thing you need in order to then just use the rest of OAuth to do the flow. And I totally agree that there are security concerns and issues around pop-ups and phishing and all sorts of things that need to get sorted out, but a lot of that work is already being done in the OAuth group and thought about there, and a lot of that experience is there. So I don't think it's an unsolvable problem, and I think there's a lot of experience there to draw from. So that's why I put this sequence together, showing what it would look like to leverage the rest of OAuth to do this. And OAuth has the answers for things like, what if you don't want to spin up a localhost server for your redirect URL? It answers things like, how do you know that the flow is done? What's the signal for that? Like, all that stuff is already done there. So it's not these aren't particularly new problems really. So that is why I wanted to put a sort of alternate proposal together that gets to the same end result here. And I guess I should mention there is one other piece of this that would need to get solved, which is the fact that these clients would be previously unknown to the authorization server, as in you download a random calendar app talking to a random CalDAV server, and they don't know about each other ahead of time, which is, like Ben mentioned, not normal in the OAuth world. In the OAuth world, things kind of get deployed all as a cohesive system. That's why I put this note on here about the client ID, where in some scenarios, actually the client ID could be pre-registered, and there'll be plenty of scenarios where that would work just fine. And in other situations, you may need to do something more dynamic or more on the fly or just straight up anonymous. And there are also starting to be some proposals for that kind of thing in the OAuth group coming as well. So again, it feels very suited for that that world.
Hi, Peter Kasselman, also working in the OAuth group. I think my one observation around this is just be very, very thoughtful on the security side to reemphasize some of the other call-outs. One of the areas that I really focus on is the human factor side. We see that as a very big vector for attacks and exploits. And I think the moment this gets, this proposal, if it gets connected to the OAuth universe, there's sort of all sorts of other interesting opportunities now for lateral moves and attacks. Right? So if this becomes an entry point where I can trick somebody to give authorization, I can use that set of authorization to start moving and doing lateral attacks. And I think these are the kinds of things that I'd really encourage you to explore very thoughtfully. You're not only, and I'm also sympathetic to the fact that there's already a big there's already pop-ups coming up, but just thinking through that and see if there's an opportunity to actually make it better. In general, my guidance with this would be, one, if you can avoid having the customer make a decision or avoid having the end user make a decision, please do so. If they're making a decision, give them the best possible information to make that decision with, and then they will make bad decisions. Please in your design, make sure that there is stopgaps and mitigations for when the end user makes a poor decision, because they will. I think what we're seeing is incredible cleverness on the side of attackers into using these pop-up type experiences to really confuse the user, to engage in social engineering. And it's actually become a major entry point. People are not so much attacking the protocol as the end user. So just use this opportunity and be thoughtful of that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric Kinnear, Apple. So I'm a little bit curious as to what mechanism we're trying to define here. We actually do something almost identical to the flow that you had on the slide earlier. If you go in the Mail app on your Mac and you ask to add a Gmail account, it will pop up a thing that uses OAuth. It uses a custom URL scheme as the redirect URI that causes it to deliver everything back into the app without having to go through weird local host bounces. So I don't know that like having the user put in a particular URL or identifying it that way is as interesting as having the user be able to just use their normal flow, which is what it already does.
So
I think
the distinction here is that instead of having the client know that it can talk to Gmail and having a button that says Gmail, I'm imagining a world where in the Mail example, we have a JMAP REST API for communication between Mail apps and Mail backends. And so the user pastes in just once an identifier of their Mail server instead of Gmail, whoever is providing Mail for them. And now I want exactly the same kind of magical authentication flow, potentially still with single sign-on through Google. But now using that to cross-authenticate into whoever their actual Mail provider is, and then using a standard protocol for that communication.
Excellent. Yeah. So being able to have anybody put that in. I think one of the things that would make this super compelling is if there's a way to reduce that kind of bouncing around. And maybe that's hard because by definition, we've kind of defined this as a pop-up. But to the comments around social engineering, even just from a user confusion, like suddenly I'm in settings, suddenly I'm in a browser, suddenly I'm somewhere else. If there's a way that we could do this that doesn't mean we have to bounce through several different screens really quickly, especially screens that involve putting in my password for something, that would be really, really cool.
All right. So Peter reminded me that this is far more challenging than even I had first thought. When I have an application that's asking for this permission, it goes off to the website. What does the website know about who is asking in this context? We're talking about a random application that's sitting on localhost, or a random application that is essentially an arbitrary binary that's running on your machine. And to Peter's point earlier, I think that's really scary. And I think there's probably a case here to be made for simply saying that that this requires some sort of server infrastructure so that the server knows who it's talking to. And then, for example, in the cargo publish example that I was talking about before, the cargo publish binary knows me and can talk to crates.io, which is their server infrastructure, and can authenticate to that. And it's crates.io that's receiving the authorization token in this case. And then it passes it back down to the command line client in that case. Otherwise,
yes, that is essentially the architecture that I imagine. One thing I would note here is that,
not what I'm saying here.
Okay.
Okay.
So one thing that I wanted to note here is that in this version of the proposal, the location of the authorization page is only given as a path, so it's meant to be on the same origin as the actual service you're trying to reach. And from there, maybe you'll go through some series of redirections to get you through a single sign-on type flow. But what
That
you're
that doesn't
authenticating
help.
to is whatever you started with.
So that doesn't necessarily help, because the application that the server thinks that it might be providing this information to, and the application that the information ultimately ends up in may be two different things, because let's just say
Yes.
that I managed to get some bad software on your machine, and then the server's
Right.
handing out tokens to that instead.
Yes. Well, so if you believe in open source, then unless you're going to invoke some kind of like client-side attestation, trusted platform stuff, the server, no server ever actually knows what software is running on the client. Client to server OAuth always has some version of this problem. And this is also how the web works, right? Like servers don't get an attestation proving what browser is being used to access gmail.com. That's just the world as we
But
accept it. This is sort of a web-like view of non-web stuff.
That's not really the sort of problem that I'm looking to address here. You've got you have clients authenticating to servers all the time. This is not a particular challenge. But if this was the only way in which you're authenticating to the server, and then you're using the interactive session in order to authenticate the user to the server still doesn't know anything about the application that it's providing this token to. And to the phishing point earlier, that becomes fraud. Whereas if you had a scenario where you have an application where a user is authenticated to a server and they're looking to access secondary resources on other services, then this becomes a little bit more interesting, because then you can use that first authentication session as the basis for knowing that this is a particular user that's receiving the information. And then you're talking about interactions between the two different servers. And then it becomes a little bit easier for the server that's giving out that token to be assured of where it's going, as opposed to random pop-up that someone just happens to spawn off on the server.
So maybe to close this conversation, I think there's two questions here to this group as HTTP API. Is there a consensus that this would be useful to HTTP API world? And then the second question is, but it's probably the OAuth folks that have all of the security knowledge to make this work securely. And so, Aaron, Ben, probably you're the best folks to talk more about how to move this forward. But there's an interest, I think, in the HTTP API space. It's just, I think the OAuth folks have the tools to make this happen, if it can happen.
Okay. Well, so yeah, I think the most likely outcome here is that Aaron and I will hopefully try to put together now a more OAuth flavored version of the protocol, and we will probably try to run that by OAuth again. I'm sure that OAuth, as always, will be looking very closely at questions about user confusion and leakage of tokens and that sort of thing.
So I did lock the queue. You were in the queue, Aaron, since I kind of handed it over to you. Do you want to have last word?
Sure. I just wanted to respond to some of the stuff that Martin said. I agree that there are concerns around unknown software talking to unknown servers. That is the kind of thing that gets discussed in the OAuth group, and there are valid use cases for that, and there are also valid use cases to prevent that, and both of those are deployment level decisions to get made all the time. If you look at what Google's done, they've really locked down who can get access to be able to do an OAuth flow at all, and depending on the scope you're requesting, So they've gone like super hard on that. In the enterprise world, it's extremely locked down. Only the enterprise admin can create a client ID in the system. Both of those scenarios would work with the OAuth version of the proposal. Both of those are enabled by it. So if you want those policies, you can still have those policies. If you want to open it up and allow your random calendar app developer to publish an open source piece of software that lives on GitHub that someone downloads and there's no binary signing anywhere, that's great. And if the server wants to enable that to happen, that's also cool. And think of also the WordPress model. Anybody can spin up a WordPress server. Anybody can write an app to use the WordPress API. Obviously, there's no prior link between the two developers. There's no registration that can happen out of band. There's no signing that can happen. But that is a useful use case if you're okay with the assumptions that, or the considerations there. So I just think writing that all down and capturing that as like, here's the assumptions, here's how you can deploy this in ways that make sense for you, that's also stuff that can be worked out in this draft.
So we should move on. Do you have a very quick comment?
Yeah, just a quick comment. Rifat from the OAuth Work Group Chair. I agree with Aaron and others that this is probably fits nicely into the OAuth Work Group. And then got great feedback from the work group interested in this one. So this is the right place for it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ben.
Okay.
And thank you for staying up until the middle of the night to come talk to us.
He's got a newborn. He's used to it.
Okay. Let's see if I can navigate my way through here. Actually, rather than me sharing my screen and then, Roberto, are you going to be sharing your screen?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I'm trying to share my screen.
Okay, it's coming.
So it's a very quick presentation. The YAML media type is almost complete. Can you see, everyone can see it, right? The YAML media type is almost complete. It's a very important specification because it allows other media type registration to be filed. The JSON schema, OpenAPI, and JSON LD media types will be addressed subsequently. So YAML media type and YAML structured syntax suffix is complete. It is in Workgroup Plus call, and there is positive feedback from the media type folks. We changed just one thing, actually. We specified that .yaml is the preferred extension, while YML is the legacy one. And we acknowledge that the relation with medium and suffixes does not require any changes. For the REST API, we need more feedback, so we are not addressing in this meeting. We just have one open issue that is related from clipboard identifiers for Windows and macOS. What we propose is to eventually merge pull request 70 that addresses the Windows clipboard identifier and skip for now, but it can be addressed. Apple folks. So we really think that we need to publish this specification that is complete. We have positive feedback. And well, let us know what should we do with pull request 70. Well, that's it. Thanks from me and the other editors. And well, questions, welcome.
This is great. I'm glad to see we're making progress on this one, and it was probably a good idea to do that split that we did from the other media types, because they seem like they have a few more things to sort out. Does anybody have any questions or feedback on the YAML media type? I see somebody walking to the mic. Alexei.
Hi, Alexei Malenkov. Yeah, I had a look at this. Need to double check the template itself. It looks fine. In regards to things like clipboard names and you know, this sort of information is useful if you know it, but I understand there aren't that many experts for this. So if you can find out what should go there, include it. If not, I don't think it's going to be a big deal.
Yeah, I did try reaching out to folks at Microsoft and looked around with the clipboard registry, and it seems like it's kind of a first come, first serve, and YAML is a fairly unique word, so it doesn't appear to already be used. So,
are you saying that there has to be an action with Microsoft?
No, there doesn't appear to be any action with Microsoft at all with regards to clipboard identifiers.
Okay. So yeah, as a media type reviewer, I'm looking forward to approving this.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you, Roberto.
After we merge these pull reports, eventually we can just start the publication procedure.
Yes, I have already started writing up beginning the Shepherd document. Okay. So. There we go. Okay, so the next part of this, we are going to just go through the other working group documents and have some discussion around the open issues. Of course, because I shared a window, I can't just change it. I have to reshare the other the tab. Give me a second. Not used to working with only one window. Yes. Let's just go entire screen. And so, if I can hide that. Go up there. Okay, so we keep track of, in the HB API working group, we keep track of the issues via the GitHub repos, and there is this common project that lists all of the different documents that we are working on, that surfaces all the various issues, and we have a status here to give us an indication of where these issues are within our shepherded pipeline. The deprecation header, unfortunately, Eric was not able to join today unless he is on the call. So I didn't see him on the call, and I'm trying to get rid of those windows that appear at the bottom, and I can't. So they'll stay there. The one open issue that comes is still really remaining from IETF114 is we ran into challenges with regards to the formatting of the date field in the deprecation header, which amongst the suggestions to move to structured headers also ran into a challenge with, well, we want the deprecation field to also be consistent with the sunset header as the two work in parallel. The outcome of that was, well, should we, instead of having two separate fields, just have one life cycle header? And I believe some of the last words from IETF 114 is, oh, that would be a really easy PR to write. It shouldn't require a whole lot of changes. Do you remember that comment, Mark?
Mark Nottingham. Yes. But we didn't actually decide to do that.
Okay.
So
In that conversation,
I maintain my position.
Excellent. Are you aware of any discussions that has happened around whether we should do that?
No.
Excellent. Well, there we go. That is the status on deprecation header.
So to avoid this happening again in Yokohama,
Yes.
we should probably have the discussion now.
Let's have that discussion now.
Cool.
Awesome. One header, two headers. Do folks have an opinion insofar as whether or not it would be valuable for us to be able to have a, let's say, a dictionary style header for lifecycle to be able to maintain the states of an API over its lifecycle? Or do we stick with sunset and have a new deprecation header? Does anybody have any opinions that they would like to share? Nobody has any opinions? Mark, go ahead.
I think it's worth trying. I think the worst case, we come up with a lifecycle header and people still use the sunset header, but my impression is that the sunset header isn't terribly widely deployed yet. And so if we're going to do it, doing it sooner rather than later would be good so that we can capture some of that adoption.
Got it. Before you go back, Mark, I have one other question for you. There was some conversation with regards to the date header and whether it would be a human readable, textable type thing versus an epoch-based integer.
Oh, that.
Yes, that.
Yes. So as I understand it, the consensus in the HTTP working group is that we will be creating a structured date type. It will be inserted into a revision of the structured fields specification. So we're going to revise the entire RFC to add it. And its representation in HTTP 1.1 text will be an @ symbol followed by an integer. And that integer is a delta from the common epoch, January 1st, 1970. There was a discussion about other textual representations. There were, personally, I think that a more human readable one would be a little friendlier, but that's because I'm very bullish on binary structured headers where the efficiency loss isn't so great. And it's not at all clear that binary structured headers are actually going to happen. Sorry, fields. Sorry, Julian. Fields. The feeling by far was that by using an integer, it would improve not only efficiency, but also remove a lot of chances for errors. Date parsing is nasty. And adds a lot of questions that people felt weren't needed. So there's a fairly strong feeling that it should be an integer. And so that's, I think, what it's going to be. Now, I shopped that around with the folks discussing, I think, both the deprecation, the deprecation header and was a little surprised to hear that seemed like it was okay if I interpreted the responses correctly. That having one way to do it and having that integer representation would be adequate. Could be wrong.
So is it fair to say that if HTTP API folks in the future want to use the date in a header that is readable, then structured fields is not an option?
That's jumping to a number of conclusions. First of all, that it's not readable as an integer. I think that in some contexts it is. I think that tooling will eventually present that as a more readable form. I think that tooling will emerge, especially as we get more headers using it. And if you do want to have a textual header that on the wire, on the bits on HTTP 1.1, mind you, HTTP 2.0 and 3, if you look at the bits in the wire, you're going to see gibberish no matter what you do. In HTTP 1.1, if you want to see an actual, human-friendly Sunday, December 5th, you could put that in a string if you wanted to. It just wouldn't have a date type.
Yes.
And you'd have to specify in detail the parsing and serialization of that date, as well as error handling.
See, that's why I asked the question, because I knew you would clarify it. Thank you.
I'm here to serve.
Okay, so that's where we are with the deprecation header. I heard a let's try it. We shall talk with the editors and get this easy PR done so that we have a lifecycle header and get feedback on it.
If I
Yes. Hold
so
on. Could you join the queue, Roberto, please?
Yeah, I think that for life cycle, the point for me in general is that it should be human readable. So if it will be, if we decide not to use, to move to structure fields, I think the value should anyway should not use a non-human readable serialization.
Mark is going to reply to that.
So we had a discussion about this, and I thought that I didn't see any other feedback to that effect that people felt that an integer would be adequate. But we'll have to have that discussion when we look at the PR. I think there are arguments to be had, but we need to come to some sort of consensus on it. Keeping in mind, if we do choose not to use a structured field type that is tailor-made for this use case, we'd better have a good explanation when we go to the ISG in last call about it. Because whilst we might get consensus in this room for one way or another, the larger consensus of the IETF may be different, and we need to be able to defend that. I got up originally just to say, could you please assign that issue to me so that I can remember to do the PR? And if you don't see a PR from me in about 2 weeks, can you ping me? Because my mind is going.
Yes, I can definitely do that. And just to, Roberto, just to reiterate what Mark said, I think that the important thing there is we are moving into a world where you don't look at HTTP headers without using some kind of tooling that does presentation, and it with the value of structured headers and the @ symbol indicating this is a date, it can definitely present those headers in a human readable format. So our world is shifting underneath us in this space. Okay, moving on to idempotency. We have one minor issue that is left here. There's been a number of issues that have been closed just recently, and this particular request, I believe, was just resolved yesterday, and so this should be closed up, which will close all of our issues on the idempotency header. Does anybody have any feedback, have had a chance to review the idempotency header, and want to share any comments with editors? just as a sense of the room, are there folks in the room who feel that they would be interested in using this idempotency header or see it as a valuable thing? I've got a few kind of, yeah, maybe, sort of. It won't do any harm. I think we have a person coming to the mic.
Miles Kleidel, with the HTTP working group, we're working on resumable uploads, and we're thinking about maybe using the idempotency key header in there. It's still like only a proposal, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion if we actually end up using it, but it looked really interesting for the problem we're trying to solve. So yeah, we'd definitely like to see where this is going.
Excellent. It's great to hear. Which brings us to the link template header. I have not seen a whole lot of feedback on this draft from Mark, which means either it is wonderful or nobody cares. There is one, I see it has been moved to structured fields. That's great. There's a PR. I added a tiny little comment on there, Mark. And so then the only open issue is this anchor parameter in URI templates, which is an interesting problem that we have run into a number of times in the past. You have thoughts?
I think I'm probably going to do this unless it doesn't, there's some unforeseen problem. I frankly haven't gotten to it. I've been a little busy with other stuff. But
Yes.
yeah, I think once these two things are done, we can go ahead and do working group last call. I still, from time to time, hear people saying, yes, I'd really like to use that. So we'll see.
Excellent. We're just ripping along here. So we've already talked about media types from the media type YAML. Both the YAML RFC and the RESTful media types for JSON schema and OpenAPI are two different documents in the same repo, so they're kind of mixed. We are still waiting on a whole bunch of feedback from the JSON schema folks. Fragment identifiers get a little funky in the JSON schema world, so they're working to resolve those. And there's a need for security considerations for the OpenAPI spec, which we have had conversations in the OpenAPI initiative about this, and we will be writing those up, and they'll largely be what the JSON schema says plus plus. So expect to see, hopefully we'll get these resolved in a few months, but we're kind of locked on the JSON schema folks at this point in time. Right, which brings us to, actually before we do rate limit headers, because I have a feeling that will have us a bit of a conversation, 7807 is going through area review. Is that the right term? And I see there was a whole load of issues that were opened up yesterday, hence why I don't have any status on these things. Mark, you have more things that have been added to your plate. But many of these issues I think that have been brought up have previously been discussed. So hopefully we'll be able to resolve these. I didn't see any in here that were tremendously controversial, more than they have been in the past. And we've solved them in the past. Okay, which brings us to rate limit headers. And if this is possibly one of the larger GitHub issues that I've seen in a while, and it boils down to structured headers. At the moment, the rate limit headers are defined as separate fields with a separate field for rate limit, remaining rate limit reset, and rate limit limit. And there is a proposal, or there is a conversation that's happening about, can we move this into a single header? But there is a disagreement, and there has been feedback from the community that they like really simple headers, that are just scalar values, but there is also the future of structured headers, and there's also the value of them being in a single header as they are related values. And so there is not consensus. I don't know, I'm trying to find a particular issue that summarizes that best. Here was so this is how it is currently used in the wild, with rate limit remaining, rate limit reset. And there's a desire from some folks to merge it into a single header. We're using structured fields. Roberta, you have opinions, I know. Do you want to make your case?
Yes, the problem here is that the industry works with 3 fields. In a previous release of this draft, we tried to conflate, to combine some of the provided information in one field, and folks ask to roll back this kind of change and provide different information in different fields. One of the issue in general is that intermediaries, API gateways, and proxies do not have natively the ability to process structured content. And since many of this kind of mangling is done by configuration and not by development, the current tooling makes very difficult to work with information that is combined in a single field. We have even one case, for example, it is the Kong API gateway, where they adopted our internet draft, but still provide the information we combine in the policy header in different fields, because they prefer for this kind of information to be split and managed atomically, because it's how the current tooling, it's what the current tooling support. So the risk we see in combining fields, 3 fields in just one field, is that we will release a specification that is significantly different from the industry practice, and that nobody will use, since it is not what the current tools support. This is the main issue. We want to standardize. We don't want to make the 14 standards out of the 13 that exist before. So, and this is the reason we created this specification.
Thank you, Roberto. Chris?
So you say that intermediaries don't have the ability to parse structured content, but that's what headers are. I mean, headers are structured content. They're keys and their values, and you split them up and you parse them. And so an intermediary that has tooling that can parse structured content, we're just spelling the structured content in a different way. And so I think I'm sympathetic to the point that intermediaries may not currently have exactly the parsers that we want them to have. But I don't know that I'm persuaded entirely that they won't. And that if we spell it this way, they're just going to throw up their hands and say, well, that uses semicolons instead of equals, and I just don't know what to do with that.
Mark?
Yeah, Mark Nottingham. with all respect, I think Roberto is focusing far too much on the very short-term deployment of the specification and the path to that. RFCs are supposed to be relatively long-lived documents. We're supposed to be creating infrastructure that lasts a long time. And if we focus too much on the exact current deployment patterns down to syntax, we're going to be so constrained that we're not going to be able to function. I think it's just a different viewpoint. I think for internet standards, we need to be focused on what's the right long-term pattern to have here. And you know, I look at this and I look at what's on the screen, and I think, well, if we had taken the approach that Roberto is talking about for the cache control header, we would have cache control max age : 30, cache control private, cache control, you know, and it would lead to an absurd design. Just putting aside the issue of deployment, ease of deployment, putting aside the issue of structured fields and whether that, you know, we should use them in what fashion we should use them. As header design, this just is really, you know, you're smearing this information across multiple headers. You're having the chance for it to be desynchronized. It doesn't make any sense to me. Now, if there are legitimate use cases where you have multiple parties touching these fields and so that there are slightly different semantics to them, by all means, split them into separate headers. But let's have a discussion about semantically what makes sense to put in the same header versus different headers, rather than just saying let's put every discrete value in a separate header, because it's not good design.
So Roberto, in this issue, you added a comment here where you talked about a gateway that is trying to modify a single field. Could you just talk more about this scenario where there's an origin server that defines some kind of rate limit header, and then a gateway then wants to modify that rate limit header before returning to the client? What is the use case for that?
For example, if you have an application that is served through two gateways, one external and one internal, maybe those two gateways want to adjust the published rate limit depending on the client, and assign different scales, different proportion of the complete quota of a single application, one for external traffic and one for internal. But again, the point is that this kind of fields are actually used in industry and infrastructures in many possible ways that we don't even know. And my concern is that if we make some distance from, if we diverge from how something that is actually used in different ways that we may know or we may not know, and that is already present in the industry, we take the risk of creating a specification that is not adopted. Because currently, people already use custom rate limit fields. And we should provide some selling point for them to adopt this specification. Which is the selling point? If they don't change, if they don't need to change anything, they are sold. And actually, they have been already sold to different gateways because they just had to change the field name. But if we need to change, if we ask them to change the structure, we don't know if they buy them. So we can take the risk of providing a specification that is not adopted easily. But I really would like to have some feedback from implementer that say, okay, for me, it doesn't take me any effort to change the new structure field, and I will do it. Because the problem is that we have implementers. Will they follow us if we change the syntax? This I don't know. For current exchanges, my feedback was generally that they are not interested to change significantly their actually deployed code. But if you have some feedback from implementers that say, okay, I will follow you in structure fields, and they do it, for me, it will be okay. But I would really see this feedback.
Okay. Chris, or do you want to go?
Yeah, hi, Rich Sauls, no hats. Right now, the industry is apparently using X- rate limit. They're going to have to make a change anyway. Your argument is, or your concern is, 2 characters is a lot easier than supporting structured fields, but structured fields are coming anyway. There's nothing that prevents existing applications from using X- rate limit ABCDE. The future direction of HTTP is clearly structured fields. I'm hoping, more than hoping, now with my hat on, I think the working group should adopt something that is headed toward the future direction of the HTTP specification. We'll have to take a working group consensus call. And of course, Roberto, thanks for emphasizing that you will do what the working group suggests, because that's your job, and our job is to figure out what the working group suggests and wants. But clearly the advice we've gotten from HTTP is structured fields are the future. So with that, Chris?
I think I may be reiterating points everyone else is making, but we need to decide whether what we're doing is documenting current practice or designing something for the future. And we should be really specific about what we're doing and why we're doing that.
Mark?
Do we want
Okay.
to have a consensus call?
We can do that. I will let you lead that.
Okay, we have discussed this a couple of times. I think everybody has had a chance to express their viewpoints. So, I don't know, do we do the poll tool or the hum tool? Yeah, okay, we're gonna hum in the room and we will take it to the mailing list, just because I miss not humming after 2.5 years. So the question is, there are 3 parts. Do you prefer 3 fields with a numeric value, or structured fields in a compound header field, whatever, or do you not know yet? So first, please hum if you are in favor of 3 headers. Please hum if you are in favor of a structured header field style. Thank you. Please hum if you are not sure yet. Okay, so we had very strong consensus to go with header fields. Some are still not sure, structured fields. Some are still not sure, and we will take that to the list to confirm. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. Okay.
So sorry, make sure I understand. Are we saying that the decision is that to go with structure field, or are we going to discuss still because some people are not clear?
So the way we'll phrase the question is, in the room we had strong consensus. Does anyone have concerns or questions about that?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And could I suggest that because there were some people who are uncertain, let's go ahead and decide the question, get the PR and get it in, and if people who were uncertain before have, new information to bring, we can always consider new information afterwards. But let's see it in action. Let's get it going. And
Okay, I think that is that was really the main issue that was holding up the rate limit header work. If we can get an answer to that, we can definitely move forward with it. And that brings us to the end of the working group documents that are. Yes, Roberto, my apologies, I didn't see you in the queue.
No, no problem. It would be great to have some help with the other folks to reach out implementers in ensuring that structure fields is a sensible choice even for them, since I think there is people from Cloudflare and other
all right. Roberto,
infrastructure folks.
correct. This is the working group is open to all. This is the working group decision. If somebody wishes to propose something else, they should. This is the venue to participate. So I understand your concern, and the IETF wants to make standards that are used, but we're not going to reach out to industry. It will be vague. You know, if you have people in industry who feel strongly about this, they should read the PR and comment. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, let me just, I believe we have any other business agenda item. Does anybody have any other business?
You want to show your workflow thing?
I can do that. Just as a informational thing, if you now go to the, let me figure out where I'm going. If you go to the website that corresponds to the HPA working group, HPA API working group, we now have little kind of flow diagrams that attempt to indicate where in the process each of the working group documents are. We have a lot of people in the HPA API community who are not necessarily familiar with how the IETF works. These diagrams, and I will try and find a way of changing the color. The circle currently indicates where this document is in the flow, but it's a little too subtle. So once I figure out how to apply styling to these mermaid diagrams, we'll be able to make that a little bit clearer. But you can see here the YAML media type is in working group last call, and the status of the other media types. And so this is a way for us to help communicate to the broader community the process and make it clear to them also that even when we say working group last call, there's a whole bunch of things downstream because there is an expectation that, yep, we're done. And then there's lots of other review that happens that is, as I'm learning, extremely valuable from upstream folks. And so, yes, you can see this on our GitHub IO website. Any other comments from you, Rich?
Nope.
Then we should consider ourselves adjourned. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you for a very productive session. Have a good week.
Thank you all. Thank you to the chats. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Roberto.
Bye, Roberto. Just close the browser window. Yeah. I figured I should play the bad guy.
I need to learn how to use the hammer.
Hey. Yeah. 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 Well, down the stuff, it's kind of really cool. You just specify the block dependencies and it renders it automatically for you.
This one I did add an IANA review because that one did go through IANA review. There was a comment on the chair that says like everything goes through IANA review. I
Yeah,
thought it was
no,
only
it's worth. Yes, not yeah. Everything goes through, and most of the reviews are nothing for us to do here. Yeah, but that's no. I mean, IANA says there's nothing for us to do. They do the positive signal. All right, sounds good.
Oh, I did one in real life.
Real life? Yeah, I know. Welcome. That's cool.
It has been interesting attending a number of other sessions.
Yeah.
Sort of seeing